The first time my father saw me in my marine dress blues, he didn't recognize me. That's the part people always find hard to believe. A ballroom full of veterans in San Antonio had just stood up applauding after I finished speaking about homeless veterans and military transition programs. There were television cameras, local reporters, Gold Star families, young Marines asking for photos. And sitting near the back of the room gripping the edge of a white tablecloth like he might fall out of his chair was the same man who left me behind when I was 15 years old, with $100, and a handwritten note that said, "You'll figure it out." I remember watching him from across that ballroom while applause echoed off the walls. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Older, gray around the temples, one hand trembling against his water glass. My brother Mason sat beside him crying openly. My mother couldn't even look at me. For 17 years, none of them had called on my birthday. None of them had shown up for graduations, promotions, funerals, deployments, surgeries, or holidays. Then Mason searched my name online one night out of curiosity, and suddenly I had 120 missed calls. Funny how family remembers your number after strangers start saluting you. But none of that started in Texas. It started in Oklahoma, back before I learned how cold silence inside a family could feel. I grew up in a small town outside Tulsa where everybody knew everybody else's business. My father, Harold Carter, worked construction most of his life. Big man, heavy boots, permanent cigarette smell. The kind of man who believed boys should be tough and girls should stay quiet. My older brother Mason could do no wrong in Dad's eyes. Mason played football. Mason hunted deer. Mason worked on engines with Dad on weekends. I was just Emily. Too stubborn. Too loud. Too opinionated. At least according to my father. If Mason forgot to do something, Dad laughed it off. If I forgot something, it became a lecture about responsibility and respect. Once when I was 13, I accidentally backed Dad's pickup truck into the mailbox while trying to move it from the driveway. Barely scratched the bumper. My father didn't speak to me for nearly 2 weeks. You see, he told my mother one night while I sat 3 feet away at the kitchen table pretending to do homework. Girls panic under pressure. That's why men handle important things. My mother said nothing. That was the part that hurt most growing up. Not always what Dad said. What Mom allowed. Her name was Denise. Soft-spoken. Tired all the time. She spent most of her life trying to avoid conflict inside that house. Especially conflict with my father. If Dad criticized me, Mom stared at the dishes. If Dad mocked me, Mom folded laundry. If Dad ignored me for days, Mom pretended not to notice. I used to think maybe she was afraid of him. Now I think she was afraid of being alone. By the time I turned 15, things inside our house had gotten worse. Dad's construction work slowed down after a rough economic stretch. Bills piled up. Everybody was tense. I worked after school at a diner off Route 51 refilling coffee for truck drivers and retirees. Most nights I came home smelling like bacon grease and cigarette smoke. Dad hated that job. Slinging hash at 15 years old, he muttered once, real classy. I'm helping pay bills, I snapped back. Wrong thing to say. He stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. You think you're grown now, he barked. Mom stepped between us before things escalated further. That night, Mason told me quietly from the hallway, "You gotta stop pushing him." I looked at my brother and remember thinking something that would stay with me for years. Nobody ever asked Dad to stop pushing me. A few months later, I came home from school on a Thursday afternoon in October. At first, I thought we'd been robbed. The living room was half empty. No television. No recliner. No family photos on the wall. The kitchen smelled like dust instead of dinner. I remember standing there frozen with my backpack still hanging off one shoulder. "Mom," I yelled. "Nothing." "Dad." Silence. Then I saw the envelope sitting on the counter. My name written across the front in my father's handwriting. Inside was a $100 bill and one sheet of lined notebook paper. Emily. We moved to Texas. Couldn't keep doing this anymore. You'll figure it out. Dad. That was it. No address. No phone number. No explanation. I think people imagine moments like that come with screaming or crying right away. They don't. Shock is quiet. I sat at that kitchen table for almost an hour staring at the note while the refrigerator hummed behind me. At some point, the sun started going down outside. That's when reality finally hit me. They were gone. My family had left the state without me. I checked every room in the house, hoping somehow I'd misunderstood. Empty closets, empty drawers. Gone, except for my bedroom. They left all my things behind like I was some tenant they forgot to evict. That first night alone still lives inside me. I locked every door twice, sat awake on the couch with all the lights on, listened to cars passing outside. Every sound made me jump. I kept thinking maybe this was some misunderstanding. Maybe they'd come back. They didn't. Around midnight, I finally cried so hard my chest hurt. Not because they left, because deep down part of me believed I deserved it. That's what happens when people blame you long enough. You start helping them do it. The next morning I called my grandmother Ruth, Dad's mother, the only person in the family who ever treated me like I mattered. She answered on the second ring. Emily. The second she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. I tried talking but couldn't stop crying. 45 minutes later, my grandmother drove 2 hours from Muskogee in an old Buick with bad brakes to come get me. She walked into that empty house, read the note once, then said something I never forgot. That son of mine ought to be ashamed of himself. It was the first time any adult had ever defended me out loud. And standing there in that half-empty kitchen at 15 years old, I realized something important. The people who abandon you always expect you to stay small afterward. I decided right then I wouldn't. My grandmother Ruth lived in a faded one-story house outside Muskogee, Oklahoma, where the porch sagged slightly on one side and wind chimes clinked against each other all night long. She was 72 years old when she took me in, living mostly off Social Security checks and tips she'd saved from decades working at a roadside diner. She didn't have much, but she made room for me anyway. That first week after my parents disappeared, I barely spoke. I slept on her old floral couch because there wasn't an extra bedroom. Most nights, I woke up panicking, convinced I'd heard my father's truck outside. Ruth never pushed me to talk. Every morning, she simply poured coffee into her chipped mug, pointed at the stove, and said, "Eggs are getting cold." That was her way of loving people. Quietly. A few days after moving in, Child Protective Services showed up. Somebody from my school had reported the situation. 2 women in county ID badges sat at Ruth's tiny kitchen table asking questions while she smoked cigarettes by the sink. "Do you feel safe here, Emily?" one woman asked gently. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you know where your parents are?" "Texas." "Do they contact you?" I stared down at my hands. "No, ma'am." Even saying it out loud felt humiliating. Ruth finally spoke from the sink. "Her parents abandoned her," she said flatly. "You can use whatever polite government word you want, but that's what happened." The social workers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Back then, people still hesitated to use words like abandonment when talking about families. Especially respectable working families like mine appeared to be from the outside. But abandonment was exactly what it was. The state eventually allowed Ruth temporary guardianship because there weren't many alternatives. Foster care systems were overloaded already, and I was old enough not to cause trouble. At least that's what one social worker accidentally said within earshot. "She's 15, quiet, not high risk." Funny phrase. Not high risk. As if children left behind somehow become less fragile because they stop crying in public. I went back to school the following Monday. That might have been harder than the empty house. Small towns survive on gossip. By lunchtime, nearly everybody knew my parents had moved away without me. Teenagers can smell weakness like sharks smell blood. One girl in algebra whispered loud enough for me to hear. Her family literally left her. Another kid asked if I'd gotten kicked out. I stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria after that. Instead, I sat behind the gym bleachers during lunch breaks with vending machine crackers and cheap bottled water from the gas station across the street. One afternoon, my English teacher, Mrs. Delaney, quietly stopped me after class. "You're carrying a lot right now," she said softly. I shrugged. "You know," she continued, "what adults do says something about them, not about you." I nodded politely, but I didn't really believe her yet. At 15 years old, I still thought if people left you, it meant you failed somehow. Meanwhile, life with Ruth settled into a routine. I helped pay utilities by continuing my diner job after school. Every weekday, I walked 3 blocks to Miller's Diner and worked until closing. That diner smelled permanently like black coffee, fried onions, and old linoleum. Most customers were truckers, factory workers, retirees, and Vietnam veterans who stayed for hours nursing refillable coffee. Older folks notice lonely kids quicker than younger people do. One regular named Walter used to leave me extra tips folded under pie plates. Another veteran named Jean once said, "You remind me of my granddaughter. Same stubborn face." I think older people recognized exhaustion in me before I understood it myself. At home, Ruth and I watched old television together most evenings. Westerns, Wheel of Fortune, local news. One night during dinner, she finally asked the question nobody else had. "Why do you think your father hated you so much?" I nearly dropped my fork. "He doesn't hate me." Ruth gave me a long look over her glasses. "Emily," she said quietly, "you don't leave your child behind if love's working properly." I didn't know how to answer that, because part of me still defended him. That's another thing people don't understand about abandoned children. You keep loving the people who hurt you long after logic says you shouldn't. Winter came early that year. Money stayed tight. Ruth's arthritis got worse in cold weather, so I started handling grocery shopping and laundry myself. One evening, while carrying groceries into the house, I found Ruth sitting at the kitchen table rubbing her chest. "You okay?" I asked immediately. "Just old," she muttered. But she looked pale. That scared me more than I admitted out loud. For the first time since my parents left, I realized I could lose Ruth too. After dinner that night, she handed me an old photo album from her closet. Inside were family pictures going back decades, black and white photographs, birthday parties, fishing trips. There were dozens of photos of Mason. Only a handful of me. I tried pretending not to notice. Ruth noticed anyway. "Your father always favored that boy," she sighed. "Harold thinks men are supposed to matter more." "Why?" She looked toward the window for a long moment before answering. "Because his own daddy treated him the same way. Men mattered, women endured." That sentence stayed with me. Women endured. Maybe that explained my mother too. Years later, I'd realized generational damage moves through families like weather patterns. Quiet, predictable, easy to ignore until the roof finally caves in. A few weeks before Christmas, my life changed again. Miller's Diner catered a funeral luncheon for a Marine killed overseas. I spent the afternoon refilling coffee while dozens of Marines in dress blues filled the room. I had never seen uniforms like that up close before. Perfect posture. Polished shoes. Quiet discipline. One older Marine noticed me staring and smiled kindly. "You thinking about joining someday?" he asked. I laughed nervously. "I don't think they'd want somebody like me." "What's somebody like you?" I opened my mouth but couldn't answer. Because honestly, by then I wasn't sure who I was anymore. That Marine studied me for a second before saying something simple. "The Corps takes broken people sometimes," he said. "Then it teaches them they aren't broken." I thought about that sentence for weeks afterward. At night, during school, while scrubbing dishes at the diner. For the first time since my family abandoned me, I started imagining a future that belonged to me instead of them. Not surviving. Becoming. And slowly, quietly, something inside me hardened. Not into bitterness. Into determination. By the time I turned 17, I had stopped expecting rescue. That sounds sad when people hear it now, but honestly, it brought a strange kind of peace. Once you stop waiting for somebody to come back for you, life becomes simpler. Harder in some ways, but simpler. You stop looking at every passing car. You stop checking the mailbox. You stop wondering if birthdays will suddenly matter again. You learn how to survive the silence. Ruth and I settled into a rhythm during my junior and senior years of high school. We weren't poor in the dramatic television kind of way. We always had food, even if some weeks it was canned soup and toast. The lights stayed on most of the time. The roof leaked during heavy rainstorms, but we kept pots under the drips. It was the kind of working-class struggle millions of Americans know well. Quiet struggle. The kind nobody applauds. I woke up at 5 every morning to help Ruth before school. Some days her arthritis was so bad she couldn't button her own sweater. I learned how to stretch every dollar. Learned which grocery stores marked down meat after 7 at night. Learned how to make detergent last longer by watering it down. At school, I mostly kept my head down. The gossip eventually faded because small towns always move on to fresher tragedies, but I noticed something had changed in me after my parents left. I trusted nobody completely anymore. Not teachers, not classmates, not boys who smiled too easily. Abandonment teaches you to prepare for exits before people even arrive. Mason still never called. That part hurt almost worse than my parents. We'd shared a house our entire lives, shared Christmas mornings, Saturday cartoons, family cookouts. Yet after they moved to Texas, it was like I had died. Sometimes late at night, I'd search his social media pages from Ruth's old computer. Pictures from football games. Pictures beside a truck Dad helped him buy. Pictures of family barbecues in Texas. My family smiling together like I had never existed. One photo nearly broke me. Christmas morning. Matching pajamas. My mother holding a coffee mug. Dad smiling beside Mason. Caption, "Fresh start in Texas. Fresh start." Like I'd been something they cleaned out of the garage before moving. That night, Ruth found me crying quietly at the kitchen table after midnight. Without saying anything, she sat beside me and pushed a tissue box toward me. "I wasn't enough reason for them to stay," I whispered. Ruth turned slowly toward me. "Emily," she said firmly, "don't you ever confuse somebody else's failure with your worth." I wish I could say those words healed me instantly. They didn't, but they planted something important. A possibility. Senior year arrived fast. By then I was working nearly 30 hours a week at Miller's Diner while finishing school. Most nights I came home exhausted. One freezing January evening, Ruth collapsed while carrying laundry. I heard the fall from the kitchen. The sound still haunts me. I found her lying beside the hallway wall, struggling to breathe. "Grandma?" Her face had gone pale gray. The ambulance took 17 minutes to arrive because we lived outside town limits. 17 minutes can feel like a lifetime when somebody you love is gasping for air. At the hospital, doctors confirmed it was heart failure. Ruth survived that episode, but afterward things changed quickly. She became weaker, slower, tired all the time. One night while I helped organize her medications, she looked at me carefully and asked, "What are you going to do after graduation?" I shrugged. "Work, probably. You're too smart to stay trapped here." "I can't afford college." "You ever think about the military?" That caught me off guard. "You serious?" "Dead serious." She nodded toward the television where a commercial for the Marines happened to be playing. "You need structure," she said, "purpose, and somewhere far away from the ghosts in this town." I didn't answer immediately, but the truth was I'd already been thinking about it for months, especially after seeing those Marines at the funeral luncheon. There was something about them that stayed with me. They moved like people who belonged somewhere. I had never belonged anywhere. A few weeks later, I visited a Marine recruiting office in Tulsa. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Morales, looked me over carefully while flipping through paperwork. "Tough upbringing?" he asked casually. I laughed once. "You could say that." He didn't pry further. That's one thing I respected about Marines from the beginning. Most of them don't care where you came from nearly as much as whether you quit. I started training immediately. Running before sunrise. Push-ups between shifts at the diner. Sit-ups on Ruth's living room carpet while old game shows played in the background. For the first time in years, I felt movement in my life instead of survival. Then Ruth died 3 months before graduation. Massive heart attack. No warning this time. I was at school when the hospital called. I remember driving there numb and shaking so hard I nearly missed a red light downtown. When I reached her room, she was already gone. I stood beside her bed completely alone in the world. No parents. No brother. No family coming. Just me. At the funeral, maybe 15 people showed up. Old co-workers from the diner, church friends, a couple neighbors. My parents didn't come. Didn't send flowers either. After the service, I sat alone in Ruth's kitchen, staring at unpaid bills stacked beside the refrigerator. Everything felt quiet in the worst possible way. Then I noticed an envelope taped beneath the sugar jar. My name written in Ruth's shaky handwriting. Inside was a letter. "Emily, if you're reading this, I'm gone." Which means you're probably sitting there trying to carry the whole world by yourself again. Don't. Listen to me carefully. You are not unwanted. You are not difficult. And you are not what your father decided you were. Don't let bitterness turn you into them. Go build yourself a good life. Love, Grandma Ruth. I cried harder reading that letter than I had the day my parents abandoned me, because Ruth was the only person who ever truly saw me clearly. 3 weeks later, after graduation, I signed my Marine enlistment papers. The bus to Paris Island left before dawn. I remember standing outside the recruiting station with one duffel bag and Ruth's letter folded inside my jacket pocket. I was terrified. Not of boot camp, of failing, of proving my father right somehow. But underneath the fear was something else, too. Hope. Small, fragile, but alive. And for the first time since I was 15 years old, I wasn't running from my past anymore. I was running toward a future. Marine Corps boot camp stripped everybody down to the truth. Not the movie version. Not the patriotic commercial version either. The real version. Sweat. Exhaustion. Humiliation. Fear. Paris Island hit me like a freight train the second those yellow footprints came into view. I still remember the drill instructor screaming before I even stepped off the bus. Move, move, move. Nobody over 60 listening to this story needs me to explain what young fear feels like. Most of you already know. Maybe not from the military, maybe from factories, farms, hospitals, marriages, layoffs, or funerals. Fear is fear. And at 17 years old, I was carrying enough of it to sink a ship. The difference was boot camp finally gave my fear somewhere to go. The first few weeks were brutal. I was smaller than most recruits and had never played sports. My Oklahoma accent got thicker whenever I was nervous, which made some recruits tease me relentlessly. One girl from Chicago called me Dust Bowl for nearly a month. I didn't care. I'd survived worse than teasing. What nearly broke me was the constant pressure, the lack of sleep, the endless inspections, the screaming, and underneath all of it, the quiet voice in my head whispering, "You don't belong here either." One afternoon during rifle training, I completely froze under pressure and failed a shooting drill. Our drill instructor, Staff Sergeant Knox, got inches from my face. "What's wrong with you, Carter?" "Nothing, sir." "Wrong answer. Something's always wrong. Fix it." I hated him that day. Years later, I understood him better. The Marines don't just train bodies. They expose weaknesses people spend years hiding from themselves. Mine wasn't fear. It was shame. Deep-rooted shame. I spent most of my childhood being told I was a burden. So anytime I struggled, my brain immediately translated it into, "See, they were right about you." That kind of damage doesn't disappear because somebody hands you a uniform. But slowly boot camp started changing me anyway. Not all at once. Little pieces at a time. I got stronger physically first, then mentally. Then something else happened that shocked me. People started depending on me. One recruit twisted her ankle during a long march and started falling behind. Without thinking, I grabbed part of her pack weight. Another girl had panic attacks at night and cried quietly into her pillow after lights out. I sat beside her whispering jokes until she calmed down. For most of my life, I thought pain only made people hard. But sometimes pain makes you observant. You learn how to recognize suffering in others because you live with it yourself. Toward the end of training, Staff Sergeant Knox stopped me after an exercise course. "You've got leadership instincts, Carter," he said bluntly. I honestly thought he had mistaken me for somebody else. Leadership. Nobody had ever connected those words to me before. Not once. The day I earned my Eagle Globe and Anchor remains one of the clearest memories of my life. We stood exhausted and filthy after the crucible, barely able to stay upright. Then the instructors started placing Marine emblems into our hands one by one. When Staff Sergeant Knox reached me, his tone changed completely for the first time. "Congratulations, Marine." Marine. Not burden. Not mistake. Not difficult. Marine. I cried harder than I expected. Not because training was over. Because for the first time in my entire life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. After boot camp came additional training, then my first duty station at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. That's where adulthood really began. The military gave me opportunities I never would have had otherwise: steady pay, college classes, structure, healthcare, a future. But it also came with sacrifices people outside the military don't always understand. Long hours, loneliness, deployments, watching marriages collapse around you, watching young people carry things they were never supposed to see. I deployed overseas for the first time at 21. I won't romanticize war. Too many people do that already. Most deployments are boredom interrupted by moments that stay with you forever. What changed my career wasn't combat. It was leadership during a humanitarian evacuation after severe flooding overseas. Chaos everywhere, families displaced, supplies running low. One senior staff officer froze under pressure during a transportation breakdown. I didn't. I started reorganizing supply routes and coordinating civilian transfers before anyone officially told me to. Later, a colonel pulled me aside. "Who taught you how to stay calm like that?" I almost laughed. Life did. Years passed quickly after that. I took college courses at night while serving active duty, slept 4 or 5 hours some weeks trying to balance everything. Eventually, I earned a commission and became an officer. The first time somebody saluted me as ma'am, I nearly turned around looking for another woman behind me. I kept Ruth's letter in my desk through all of it, especially on difficult days. And there were difficult days. Being a woman in the Marines meant constantly proving yourself twice. Some men respected you immediately. Others waited for mistakes. A few openly resented female officers entirely. But I learned something important over the years. Competence eventually silences most people. Not everybody, but most. By my early 30s, I was leading younger Marines myself. Some came from rough homes like mine. Some reminded me painfully of the scared 17-year-old girl who arrived at Paris Island, believing she was fundamentally unwanted. I made sure those Marines knew somebody saw them. Then one night, everything changed again. I was living near Quantico by then, working stateside after years of deployments and leadership assignments. A younger officer texted me late one evening. "Ma'am, are you aware your interview's online?" Earlier that week, I'd participated in a televised segment about veterans transitioning into civilian careers and homelessness prevention programs. I didn't think much about it at the time. Apparently somebody in Texas did. Around midnight, my phone started buzzing. Unknown number. I ignored it. Then another call. Another. Voicemails started piling up. Emails. Facebook messages. Even LinkedIn requests. I checked one voicemail and nearly dropped the phone. It was Mason. Older sounding. Crying. Emily, please call me back. I sat frozen at my kitchen counter listening to his breathing shake through the speaker. Then came another voicemail. My mother. Then another. My father. By sunrise, I had 120 missed calls. After 17 years of silence, my family had suddenly remembered I existed. I didn't call anybody back that first day. I turned my phone face down on the kitchen counter and went to work instead. That probably sounds cold, but people who've never been abandoned don't understand something important. When somebody disappears from your life for nearly 2 decades, they stop feeling real after a while. They become memories, ghosts, old scars that ache when storms roll in. Then suddenly those ghosts start calling your cell phone at midnight. It doesn't feel emotional at first. It feels invasive. At work that morning, I sat through meetings pretending everything was normal while my phone buzzed every few minutes inside my desk drawer. By lunchtime, I had 3 new voicemails from my mother alone. The first one was mostly crying. The second was shaky apologies. The third said something that made my stomach twist. We didn't know how to find you. That was a lie. The Marines had tracked me down every time I moved for 17 years. My family could have found me anytime they wanted. They just never needed to until my name started appearing online. That thought sat heavy in my chest all afternoon. That evening, I finally listened to my father's message. His voice sounded older, slower. We should talk, he said flatly. Family belongs together. No apology. No acknowledgement of what they'd done. Just family belongs together. I actually laughed when I heard it. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. The same man who abandoned his 15-year-old daughter suddenly wanted to lecture me about family. I deleted the voicemail. But I couldn't delete what came next. Memories. That's the thing nobody warns you about when old wounds reopen. You don't just remember events, you remember feelings. The empty house. The silence. The shame. For days after the call started, I barely slept. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning replaying moments I thought I buried years earlier. My father criticizing me at dinner. My mother staring silently at dishes while he tore me apart. Christmas photos online without me. The note? Always the note. You'll figure it out. One night I sat alone in my apartment staring at Ruth's old letter while rain tapped against the windows. I realized something uncomfortable then. Part of me still wanted them to love me. 17 years later, after everything, some wounded little piece of me still wanted my parents to say, "We were wrong." Instead, they kept calling like we'd simply lost touch after a misunderstanding. A week passed before I finally answered Mason. He called during a Sunday morning while I was cleaning my apartment. I almost ignored it again. Something stopped me. Hello? Silence, then shaky breathing. Emily. I leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the phone tighter. His voice sounded older than I expected. Tired. Yeah. Oh my God, he whispered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, I didn't think you'd answer. I almost didn't. That's fair. Another silence. Then unexpectedly, Mason started crying again. Not dramatic crying. The kind grown men do when they've carried guilt too long. I saw you online, he said quietly. That interview, those Marines talking about you. I closed my eyes. Mason. No, let me say this first. His voice cracked. We were horrible to you. That hit harder than I expected. Not because it erased anything. Because it was the first honest sentence anybody in my family had spoken in 17 years. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. You left me, I whispered. I know. I was 15. I know. You never even called. His breathing hitched again. I was 16, Em. Dad controlled everything back then. I should have fought harder for you. Anger rushed through me so suddenly I started shaking. You should have done something. I know. You were my brother. I know. The silence afterward felt enormous. I realized tears were running down my face too. Not graceful tears either. Years of them. You have any idea what that did to me? I asked quietly. No, he admitted, probably not. That honesty saved the conversation. Most people rush to defend themselves when confronted with pain they caused. Mason didn't. He just listened. So I told him about the empty house. About sleeping scared on Ruth's couch. About working diner shifts through high school. About Ruth dying. About burying her alone. At one point, Mason started sobbing openly. "She died," he whispered. "Yes." "Oh my God. You didn't know?" "No, Dad told us she stopped talking to the family." I actually felt dizzy hearing that. Even now, years later, that still angers me. My father had rewritten reality so completely that even Mason believed it. "Why now?" I finally asked. "What do you mean? Why contact me now?" Mason hesitated too long. That hesitation answered everything. "Dad's sick," he admitted quietly. Of course he was. That's how these stories usually go. People ignore the bridges they burned until they realize they might die standing alone. What kind of sick? Heart problems, diabetes. His kidneys are bad too. I rubbed my forehead slowly. And suddenly he wants a daughter again. That's not fair. A bitter laugh escaped me. "Fair," I said softly. "Mason, I was 15 years old." He didn't answer. Because there wasn't an answer. Finally he said, "Mom wants to see you." I stared out the rain-covered window for a long time before responding. The truth was, part of me wanted to see them too. Not for revenge. For closure. I needed to know whether they felt guilt or merely regret. Those are different things. Guilt says we hurt you. Regret says this became inconvenient for us. "Emily?" I exhaled slowly. "One weekend," I said, "that's all." "You'll come." "One weekend," I repeated firmly. After hanging up, I sat motionless at the kitchen table for nearly an hour. Outside, rain kept falling against the windows. Inside, 17 years of anger shifted quietly into something more dangerous. Hope. I flew into San Antonio on a gray Thursday afternoon in early October. The moment the plane touched down, I felt my chest tighten. Texas. For 17 years, that word meant abandonment to me. Not highways or ranches or barbecue restaurants. Just loss. I rented a mid-sized sedan and drove north through traffic with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Every exit sign felt strangely familiar, even though I'd barely spent any time in the state. Mason had texted me the address the night before. A quiet subdivision outside New Braunfels. Middle-class neighborhood. Trimmed lawns. Pickup trucks and driveways. The kind of place my father always wanted. As I drove, I kept rehearsing what I'd say when I saw them. But every version sounded wrong. Angry speeches sounded childish. Polite conversation felt dishonest. Truthfully, I didn't know what a daughter was supposed to say to people who abandoned her before she was old enough to drive. About 20 minutes from the neighborhood, I stopped for gas. That's where something happened I still think about sometimes. I was standing beside the pump in jeans and a navy windbreaker when an older man across the station kept staring at me. Late 70s, maybe. Vietnam veteran hat. Cane beside his truck door. Finally, he walked slowly toward me. "Excuse me," he said politely. "You're Major Carter, aren't you?" I froze. Normally, I avoided attention whenever possible. "Yes, sir." His face lit up. "I saw your interview about homeless veterans." He reached out carefully to shake my hand. "My grandson's a Marine. Just wanted to thank you for what you do." That simple moment hit me harder than I expected. Because strangers had shown me more kindness over the years than my own family ever had. "Thank you," I said softly. He nodded once. "Your parents must be proud." I smiled politely. But inside, something twisted painfully. If only he knew. By the time I reached the neighborhood, my nerves were humming like power lines. Mason was waiting outside the house. I recognized him immediately, despite the gray creeping into his beard. He looked older than 42 should look. Tired around the eyes. The second he saw me step out of the car, he started crying again. I honestly didn't know what to do with that. He walked toward me slowly, like I might disappear. "Hey, Em." Nobody had called me that in nearly 20 years. "Hey." For a second, we just stood there awkwardly. Then he hugged me. I stayed stiff at first. Not out of cruelty. My body genuinely didn't know how to respond. Eventually, I hugged him back carefully. And suddenly, we were both crying in the middle of a suburban driveway while somebody's lawn sprinkler clicked nearby. Life's strange like that. "You look good," he said, wiping his face. "You too." "That's a lie," he laughed weakly. The house behind him was modest but comfortable. Brick exterior, wind chimes on the porch, a small American flag near the garage. Normal. That bothered me more than if it had looked terrible. I think some part of me wanted visible proof they'd suffered after leaving me behind. Instead, they'd built a regular life. Mason led me inside. The smell hit first. Coffee, laundry detergent, pot roast cooking somewhere. Family smells. My mother stood in the kitchen doorway clutching a dish towel so tightly her knuckles looked white. She looked much older than I imagined. Smaller too. The second our eyes met, she started crying. "Oh my God," she whispered. I didn't move. Neither did she. 17 years is too long for a normal hug. Finally, she stepped forward hesitantly and touched my arm like she needed proof I was real. "You're really here." "Yeah." Then my father appeared from the hallway. Everything inside me locked up instantly. Harold Carter looked old. Not old the way I imagined during angry years when I hoped life punished him. Just human old. Softer around the shoulders. Gray-haired? Walking slower. He stopped several feet away, staring at me silently. And for one strange second I saw confusion in his face. Like he couldn't reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the teenager he abandoned. "You came," he said finally. I nodded once. Nobody moved. Nobody knew the rules for this kind of reunion. Eventually, Mason cleared his throat awkwardly. "Dinner's almost ready." That first meal together was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. Polite conversation. Weather. Traffic. Military travel. All of us pretending there wasn't a 17-year grave sitting in the middle of the table beside the mashed potatoes. Then I noticed something. Family photographs lined the hallway walls nearby. Mason graduating. Mason fishing. Mason getting married years earlier before divorcing. Mason beside Dad at football games. I searched carefully. There were almost no pictures of me. One old elementary school photo near the laundry room. That was it. The realization landed like a punch to the chest. They erased me. Not emotionally. Literally. During dessert, my father finally spoke directly about the past. "We thought you were stubborn enough to survive," he said quietly. The room went still. I looked at him for several seconds before answering. I was 15. Nobody spoke after that. Because there was nothing to say. Later that evening, Mason and I sat outside while our parents went to bed early. Texas air felt warm and heavy compared to Virginia. Crickets chirped somewhere beyond the fence line. "You scared him tonight," Mason admitted. I stared into the darkness. Good. He deserves that. I glanced at him, surprised. Mason rubbed his hands together slowly. "You want to know the truth?" he asked. "Probably." He sighed heavily. "Dad always hated how much you reminded him of Grandma Ruth." I frowned. "What?" She spoke her mind. "Didn't back down from men. Dad said you had the same look in your eyes she did." I leaned back, silently processing that. All those years. All that anger. And part of it traced back to a grown man resenting strong women. Mason swallowed hard before continuing. "When you started pushing back as a teenager, I think Dad decided you'd become another Ruth." I laughed once, bitterly. "So he threw me away." "No," Mason said quietly. "He punished you." That sentence stayed with me long after we went inside. Because deep down I knew my brother was right. The Veterans Charity Banquet took place the following evening at a historic hotel ballroom in downtown San Antonio. I almost didn't go. Even after agreeing months earlier through military channels, every instinct in my body wanted to avoid standing in front of crowds while my family sat watching me. Especially my father. That afternoon I stood in the hotel bathroom staring at myself in the mirror while fastening the collar of my marine dress blues. Dark navy jacket, rows of ribbons, polished brass, white gloves folded carefully beside the sink. Every uniform inspection from my career echoed automatically in my head, while I adjusted tiny details no civilian would ever notice. But underneath all that discipline, my hands were shaking. Not from public speaking. I'd done interviews before. I was afraid of becoming 15 years old again the second my father looked at me. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Emily, my mother's voice, called gently through the door. "They're almost ready downstairs." For a moment I couldn't answer. Then I opened the door. My mother gasped quietly when she saw me fully dressed in uniform. Not dramatic, just stunned. Like reality had finally become impossible for her to avoid. "You look..." Her voice cracked. "You look beautiful." I nodded politely. "Thank you." She wiped tears quickly before they fell. "You always wanted someone to be proud of you," she whispered. "I should have said it more." I looked away because hearing that hurt worse than criticism ever did. A few minutes later, we entered the ballroom together. The room held maybe 300 people. Veterans, local officials, military families, older couples in formal clothes, volunteers from veteran outreach organizations. Soft piano music drifted through the air. The second we walked in, several Marines near the entrance straightened immediately when they saw my uniform. One younger corporal smiled. "Evening, ma'am." "Evening." My father noticed that. I could tell. He noticed how strangers respected me automatically. Not because of fame. Because of service. Because of earned responsibility. For most of my childhood, my father acted like I'd never become anything important. Now decorated Marines kept calling me ma'am. I think that contradiction unsettled him deeply. Our table sat near the middle of the ballroom. Throughout dinner, people kept approaching to shake my hand. A retired Navy nurse thanked me for supporting homeless veterans. An older Korean War veteran told me his granddaughter joined the Marines because of women like me. One young female lieutenant asked quietly if she could take a picture with me later, because there still aren't many senior women Marines to look up to. Every single interaction seemed to make my father smaller in his chair. At one point, I caught him staring silently at my medals while the room buzzed around us. Not pride. Regret. Then came the speech. When my name was announced, the room applauded warmly as I walked toward the podium beneath soft ballroom lights. I spotted my family immediately near the center tables. My mother already crying, Mason sitting rigid beside her, my father staring directly at me. I adjusted the microphone slowly, and suddenly I remembered that empty Oklahoma kitchen. The note, the $100. You'll figure it out. Funny thing is, I did. The audience quieted. Good evening, I began calmly. For the next several minutes, I spoke about veterans returning home after service, about loneliness, about rebuilding purpose after trauma, about homeless veterans sleeping inside cars while struggling silently with pride and shame. Real American problems, the kind older audiences understand because many have watched neighbors or relatives go through them. Then I shifted slightly. When people talk about resilience, I said carefully, they sometimes imagine strength means never being hurt. The ballroom stayed completely silent. But that's not true. Real resilience means being hurt deeply and choosing not to become cruel afterward. I saw my father lower his eyes. I continued. Some people grow up surrounded by support. Others grow up learning survival very young. But no child becomes stronger because they were abandoned. My mother covered her mouth crying. I wasn't speaking loudly. Didn't need to. Quiet truth carries farther. What changes lives, I said softly, is when somebody finally looks at you and says, you still matter. At that moment I thought about Ruth, her tiny kitchen, her cigarette smoke, her tired hands pushing scrambled eggs toward me every morning after my parents disappeared. My throat tightened briefly before I continued. That's why service matters. Military service, community service, helping veterans, helping struggling families, helping forgotten people, because dignity can save a human life. The room rose in applause before I even finished. Hundreds of people standing, clapping, some veterans saluting. I stood there overwhelmed for a second, not because of recognition. Because 17 years earlier, I truly believed nobody would ever value me again. After the ceremony ended, people crowded around tables talking and taking photographs. Several younger Marines asked questions about leadership and deployments. While speaking with them, I noticed my father standing alone near the back wall holding a coffee cup with both hands. He looked lost. Eventually, I walked over quietly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. I was wrong about you, he said hoarsely. Simple sentence. But it looked painful for him to say. I waited. His eyes looked watery and exhausted. I spent years thinking toughness meant pushing people hard. He swallowed carefully. Truth is, I pushed you away. Hearing my father admit fault felt strange. Not triumphant. Heavy. Sad. Because no apology can return 17 lost years. I needed a father, I said quietly. His face crumpled slightly. I know. You made me feel unwanted. I know. For the first time in my life, Harold Carter looked genuinely ashamed. Not defensive. Not angry. Ashamed. And standing there in that crowded ballroom filled with strangers applauding my accomplishments, I realized revenge had never really been what I wanted. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted truth. Most of all, I wanted the pain named honestly. Part 7. What family really means. Word count, 1048. The end. If this story touched something in your heart, maybe take a moment tonight to think about the people who helped carry you through hard seasons of life, or the people who may still be waiting to hear that they mattered more than they knew. And if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after rejection, loss, or silence, I hope Emily's story reminds you that your worth is not decided by the people who failed to see it. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to share, subscribe, and leave a comment about the person who stood by you when life became difficult. Sometimes one kind voice can change the direction of someone's entire life.